Okay, is this working? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to start. We have one more panelist coming here in person, and we have another panelist online. But it's great to be here with all of you here at the COP. Now, bear with us while we figure out some of the logistics around the virtual participation. But my name is Rishikesh Rambandari, and I work at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. So I will be moderating the panel today after doing a very short presentation. This side event is being co-organized with Greenovation Hub. Now, just to sort of say a few words on the general context, we all know that climate change, biodiversity loss, poverty, and debt levels are inextricably linked, and that governments must address these challenges together. So this particular side event will explore some of these questions, such as how can governments scale up climate action and nature-positive development in the context of debt distress and fiscal constraints? How can developing countries leverage development finance to tackle debt distress while laying the groundwork for a climate-resilient and nature-positive future? And finally, what are some of the innovative mechanisms that could drive climate-resilient, nature-positive cooperation? So let me quickly introduce the panel, and I'll go sort of in the order in which I'll be asking folks to make their interventions. So on my immediate left, we have Richard Coswell-Wright, who is the Division Chief of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division at UNCTAD. We will have Hongyu Guo online. She is the Deputy Director of Greenovation Hub. We will then go to Red Constantino, Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, who's also the Deputy Co-Chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum's Expert Advisory Group. And finally, we'll go to sort of my furthest down this panel, Saliha Lockwood, who is Senior Climate Strategy and Policy Specialist at the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. I'm going to start by doing a very short presentation on the V20's debt profile, and then I'll come to Richard. So I'll be presenting from the podium. Okay, so we did an exercise to examine the debt profile of the V20 economies, and the goal really was to understand who really needs to be at the table if there is to be an overall comprehensive debt restructuring deal. And the effort was to identify, which are the most relevant and salient actors for the V20. Now, some of you probably know who the V20 are, but the Climate Vulnerable Forum is a group of 58 of the climate vulnerable economies, and they were up to 55 until just 2 weeks ago, but at the annuals meeting they have increased their membership to 58. Now, just to say a few quick words on the Task Force for Climate Development and the IMF, which we host at Boston University. It's a global consortium of global South-based institutes, and we have 2 developing country coalitions who are a part of the task force. This includes the G24 as well as the V20, and we have global South partners from around the world, as you can see on the slide. Now, the vision of the task force is to utilize rigorous empirical research to advance a development-centered approach to climate change at the IMF. Now, this is, of course, with the understanding that the IMF has an important role to play in supporting a just transition to a low-carbon economy. Just a very few key takeaways from the analysis that we did. The first thing that really stands out when we look at creditors is the diversity of creditors that are actually in the mix. And so what this suggests is the need for a very broad engagement across all creditor classes. Second, multilateral development banks, we don't talk about them in the context of debt relief that much, but they actually have an extremely important role to play. Private creditors are very, very important, especially for certain V20 economies, but their salience really varies across the V20. And finally, multilateral development banks can play a key role in providing guarantees to help reduce risk and to reissue bonds. Something to note is that the V20, even though it's 58 economies, they actually are not well represented within the IMF's decision-making structure. So you can see they are just 4% of the quota shares, 5.3% of the vote shares, and this is despite 16.7% of the global population and almost 40% of the share of IMF programs, right? That is, the IMF, the IMF's climate policies, therefore, very much are relevant to the V20, given that 40% of the programs are actually directed at the V20 members. So when we looked at the debt stock for V20, you can see the large red band. That's private creditors. That's approximately 36%. And then we broke out the World Bank because of its significance as a creditor class, which is the second beam right below private creditors, and MDBs are the third one. And so you see Paris Club members in China as sort of smaller bands, and other bilateral is a much smaller one. And this is China gets a lot of attention, but this sort of shows you what the actual debt stock makeup actually is. When you look at annual payments, bondholders, again, are sort of the largest share, followed by multilateral development banks and bilateral Paris Club, actually. Now, when we look at the V20 debt profile in comparison to the other developing countries, what we see is that the share of bilateral creditors is sort of marginally higher. The multilaterals without the World Bank, and this is particularly true for the Caribbean members, as you can imagine, it's higher than the average. Now, so what does this mean in terms of climate and swap deal? Debt for climate swap deals. The IMF recently released a working paper on debt for climate swaps. Now, this is we view this as a very welcome development. Now, the focus really, however, needs to broaden from only adaptation, which they see as the primary way to reduce sovereign risk, to also include mitigation, because transition impacts or transition risk is also a key determinant of sovereign risk. Now, our research has also been showing that countries, as well as the IMF, for example, will need to incorporate the full spectrum of climate risks into IMF surveillance, but also sort of national policy, so that we're not just talking about climate impacts, which has traditionally been the focus. And so finally, and I'll conclude over here, is to advance climate and development goals together. We need to evolve from isolated debt swap arrangements to a broader climate-linked restructuring. It's also important to have nationally defined, right, country-led key performance indicators as a part of these restructuring packages. Now, especially for the V20, where climate prosperity plans could be a major instrument in this regard. And finally, it's extremely important, given the charts that I showed you regarding private sector, it's extremely important to have private sector participation, especially with the substantial headroom that multilateral development banks have to guarantee debt reissuances. So let me stop here, and then I will pass it over to Richard for his remarks.
Rishi, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. I think Rishi wanted me just to talk a little bit about the global context for the presentations this afternoon. I mean, I guess if there's one thing that everyone agrees on in this discussion on the climate challenge, it's that it will require a huge investment push to be into mitigation, into adaptation, to meet the goals that need to be met without damaging existing development goals, which are for many developing countries just as important as their climate goals, of course. And people more or less agree on the scale of this challenge. Most people talk in the order of 2 to 3% of global GDP as being annually as being the kind of figure that is required to meet the investment challenge in the requisite time frame that we're talking about. So you're talking about in the order of $2 to $3 trillion at least that needs to be mobilized for developing countries to meet the climate challenge without damaging their existing development objectives. I think to get a grasp of what that means, you need to look, at least the work that we do in UNCTAD, you need to look not just at the goals themselves or the billions to trillions number, you need to look at the overall environment in which this kind of mobilization is expected to take place. And I think there are three kind of overriding pressures or trends that need to be examined carefully if we're going to get our heads around the kinds of numbers that people are talking about and the challenges that particularly developing countries face when it comes to mobilizing resources on the scale that we're talking about. The first kind of set of pressures that we need to look at are ideological or normative, the kind of way in which the policy challenge itself is framed. And I think it's fair to say that the dominant way in which that is discussed in developed and developing countries, and certainly in most international agencies, is what we would call neoliberalism. Not simply the idea that markets are somehow the optimal way of mobilizing resources, although within that discourse, the rationality of prices and competition and markets is certainly an important part of the discussion. But the neoliberal discourse is much more about the way in which interference with the private sector is somehow limited, whether that's interference by states or by organized labor or by other pressures coming from civil society or government. The idea of the neoliberal agenda is to limit that kind of intrusion onto the space of private actors to do what they do best and to do it profitably. That's essentially what the neoliberal agenda is all about, and it remains the dominant, despite its record, which I'll talk about in a second, that remains the dominant ideology. It's the dominant ideology that you will hear in this COP, particularly coming from advanced economies. The second and related issue, the trend that you need to get your heads around when thinking about the mobilization challenge, is the trend around financialization. Finance has become the dominant activity around which economic activity and profit-making is organized in the 21st century. It's not just that financial sectors and financial institutions have become much more prominent, which they have. It's that somehow everything has to be seen as an asset class with a potential income stream. And the object of a financialized economy is to try and convert as many things as you can into that kind of asset class with a potential income stream into which investments can then be made. So that notion of financialization as a driving force of economic activity has certainly become very dominant in many economies over the course of the last 3 to 4 decades. It goes along with an understanding that liberalizing capital markets, opening up your current and your capital account, are critical factors ensuring what should be, what is promised at least, efficient, the most efficient outcomes in terms of the allocation of the resources available to you. And the final element in the kind that we need to get we need to introduce into the narrative to understand the scale and the complexities of the resource mobilization challenge we're talking about, and one that's neglected a lot particularly in the discussions that I hear today. We hear a lot about financialization in the COP and all the various financial techniques that go along with that, blended finance, public-private partnerships, securitization, the whole array of financial instruments that apparently are going to deliver this movement from billions to trillions that is needed to make the investment transition we're talking about. But the last element that is much neglected, that has been a very prominent feature of the way in which economies have evolved over the last 2 or 3 decades, is the growing influence of large corporate power in the structuring of markets and the allocation of resources. The concentration of markets, all markets, it's particularly true of financial markets, but it's true of pharmaceutical markets. A lot of markets have become much more concentrated, in which 3 or 4 firms actually dominate the decisions that are made in terms of the operation of the markets in which they are operating. So the rise of corporate power and the concentration of corporate power, along with the financialization of economic activity and the dominant narrative around the efficiency of markets, are the world in which we are currently meant to mobilize the kind of resources on the scale that we're talking about to affect a just transition towards a zero-carbon world. The problem is there's very little evidence to suggest that this kind of world will deliver that. So if you look at the consequences of this environment, there are certain things that we know that it generates. We know that it generates a lot of inequality. Inequality along several axes has been increasing over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. The one that we think is a particularly important measure of inequality over this period, one that again tends to get neglected, is the allocation of income between wages and profits. So in almost all countries, the share of national income going to wages has been declining, and the share of national income going to profits has been rising everywhere. At different speeds, it has to be said, but that's a ubiquitous trend in the global economy. And it's a very important trend, because part of the justification for the kind of neoliberal story is that if we have an increase in the share of profits in national income, that's the basis in which we can get increased investment in the things that we need to make the just transition. And that's an idea you should keep in your heads, because it's not true, unfortunately, and I'll come back to that in a second. So inequality has been certainly rising. Indebtedness has been rising significantly. So particularly as wages have been kept down, many households have been forced into borrowing money to keep their lifestyles going, and many governments have been forced to borrow because the tax base has been eroded as these powerful corporations have been able to move their activities around the world to avoid paying the kinds of taxes that government needs to provide the services that governments are meant to provide. And to compensate for that, governments have been forced into borrowing extensively to keep the ship of public services and public investment moving in the right direction, even though in most cases it hasn't been doing that because they haven't been able to borrow sufficiently to do that, and the servicing of those debts has been rising. The last trend, which is critical to our story, is that investment has, despite creating an environment that is good for business, in spite of the fact that the share of profit in overall national income has been rising, investment has not been increasing. That is, the share of investment in national product in most economies, developed and developing, there are exceptions of which China is the most prominent, but in most economies the share of investment in overall income has been declining. So despite the fact that we're providing an environment which is good for business, which is good for firms in terms of the lack of regulatory oversight, in terms of the repression of wages, et cetera, these firms have not been investing in the kind of productive activities that we need to make the investments that are required to make a just transition. So this is an environment. So despite all the talk that the private sector somehow is going to deliver, there is very little evidence that this kind of environment mobilizes lots of finance, but most of that finance goes into other financial transactions. It doesn't go into supporting productive investment. And let me just leave you with one figure that I think is astounding, that kind of shows the scale of the challenge that we face. For the S&P 500 firms, that is some of the largest firms on the stock markets that the S&P measures. For that group of firms, research has shown that for every $10 in profits that those firms make, $9 are used for either paying out dividends or buying back their own shares, or in some case buying the shares of other corporations in the form of mergers and acquisitions. That leaves $1 out of every 10 that they make in profit to make the investments in productive investment, in research and development, in skill development that is needed to affect the kind of positive low-carbon development strategy that we want to see. And that's not a world that can deliver a just transition. If that's the world in which we have to operate in, we're not going to get it from this kind of environment, which I think is why we need to think much more ambitiously, and I'll leave it at this, about a public sector-driven investment agenda that can make the kinds of the big investments in mitigation and adaptation that are the prerequisite for building not only a sustainable world, but also an inclusive world too. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. Let me go to Saliha next, because our colleague Hong Yu is going to be joining at the end. So yeah, Saliha, if you could, take it away.
So I'm representing the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on this panel, and this is a really interesting topic for us to really think about and see what approach we take. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, if some of you may not know, is one that was set up about 6 years ago, just at the time of the Paris Agreement. And its fundamental mandate is very much anchored in addressing, I would say, the challenges that were brought forward under the Paris Agreement in terms of addressing both climate and development. And the bank has specific targets, which are to have full Paris alignment by 1st July 2023, which actually means, in terms of what we use as a basis for operationalizing that, is what several other MDBs are using, what's called a joint MDB framework. And often, I think there's also a confusion between our targets of getting to net zero, low carbon. What does that mean? But in the joint MDB framework that's publicly out there, you can't say an investment is Paris aligned if it doesn't have both mitigation and adaptation considerations. So each investment has to go through a vulnerability assessment, and what we call it our building block 1 and building block 2. So that's one aspect of what we're doing. The other is in terms of our target, which is a 50% climate finance target by 2025. We, maybe partly by virtue of applying the Paris alignment, we got to 48% of our investments in climate finance as per the tracking methodology that we utilize amongst the MDBs. Those frameworks, of course, we're continuing to improve, continuing to make sure that they are as supportive of the development priorities as well of our clients, whether they work with them. In fact, even within the Paris alignment methodology, we have this recognition of differentiated responsibilities within the actual terminology of the joint MDB methodology. So here at COP, we came with three main messages. The what. The what is that we need to be mobilizing finance, which is, again, part of our core themes within the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And there's various financing structures that I can come to on that. The second is the how. And one of the areas that we work on in infrastructure investment is to try to see what are those technologies at all different levels can address mitigation and adaptation. So technology is one of the key solutions. Now, how can we support to get the technologies that are already tried and tested, rolled out and scaled up, and those that are innovative get to a stage that they can be rolled out. And the third is adaptation and resilience. This is particularly important for us. We were able to triple our adaptation finance in 2021. Of course, it's from a low level. It still need a long way to go. And I need to focus on that more. And what we're doing with that particular area of work is trying to tap into the, as you were saying, in terms of the neoliberal structure, the capital markets, but trying to utilize that so that we are focusing on getting capital to resilience activity via resilience bonds. So those are the three main messaging areas we came here with. So going back to the first one, and maybe I could should I come back with specific examples later or now? Now? Okay. So we have, we provide sovereign and non-sovereign loans and also equity investment. But what we've done at COP27 is, yes, we have these different financing approaches, structures, and our shareholders are countries. Many of them are low-income countries. So what we have signed up to, for instance, is on the 8th of November, we signed up to what was called the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet. And that's a philanthropic organization. It's a partnership, and it's trying to make sure that we are able to really utilize the capital that we've got from our members in an effective way in the philanthropic space at a global level. The second one is with the intergovernmental organization IRENA. It's not a bank, it's a representative of countries, but what it's doing is it's got a platform called the Energy Transition Accelerator Financing Platform, and it's trying to make sure that it also is supporting countries to be able to get projects that are renewable energy projects that are not being funded, are being able to be funded with this new platform. And we've provided 300 million in capital to that as an anchor investor together with the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development. So that's a different model. We also want to make sure in that first piece of mobilizing capital that when we're getting into new technology areas, for instance, there's a lot of talk of green hydrogen. We don't want to come in there like cowboys. So what we've done is we've engaged with the Green Hydrogen Organization to make sure that we're working with different stakeholders to see that we invest in the right way in green hydrogen and that there's common standards. In fact, our Vice President just spoke at another event, which was just an hour ago or so, where, for instance, the question from the audience was from an ISO representative to say, if you're going to get into this area, we need to try to make sure that they're global standards that don't create the inequalities that you're also talking about. And this is just in terms of my own reflections and my own experience from having facilitated a particular facility with the IRENA for over 9 years, and also working through the carbon markets prior to that. We need to have this careful balance between requirements for impact, but then making sure that those requirements and indicators are not counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. So for instance, if there's this very precise focus on measurement and reporting and verification, you might end up that you supporting the large-scale industrial projects that can put together the paperwork that's necessary for that. So we're relatively new MDB, and we're trying to do things differently. We're engaging with the MDBs that are there to learn from them, because they have many years of experience having been through this. And my final point, I've focused a lot on mitigation and adaptation. We've also signed up to the nature statement that was made at COP26. And in fact, we have a particular person that, you always need a champion. There's a particular person within the bank that is focusing on biodiversity and nature, and we will be at COP15. We're trying to see how do we get that in, because this debt for nature swap is very interesting for us. And we're even exploring in that context, different ways of valuing and trying to see what's the appropriate methodology. So in that context, I just wanted to make sure that I also end with the point that in the joint MDB statement that we have, we actually recognized an integrated aspect of nature, biodiversity, together with climate considerations. And that statement is, of course, publicly available. I'll stop there. I can also speak a little bit about other, there's one final point, should I just make one? So, which is about climate resilient debt clauses. This is something that we are exploring, and it is trying to address the debt issue for countries where you would provide some respite if there's a climate impact. And you can find out more about it by typing in CRDC. Thanks.
Yeah, great, thank you. I might come back to you on that, because I saw the announcement yesterday on the International Capital Markets Association endorsing climate resilient debt clauses, right? So there's definitely a lot of, I think, movement on that front. If we could have our speaker up on the platform. So we have somebody who will be speaking to us through the platform. If the tech folks could help us beam her in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Hongyu. Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, hello everyone. It is really a great honor to be here and share in this side event co-organized by Boston University Global Development Policy Center and the Greenovation Hub. I'm Guo Hongyu from G-Hub, and I will actually have slides. However, the internet is slow. I cannot share it with Rishi, so I will just speak. I will share a bit about our observation and on how we can scale up climate financing for a net zero and climate resilient development in China, in Asia. Actually, we think that China could play a key role in global climate finance market from two aspects. One is China itself is a key player in international climate policy development, market development. And on the other hand, China could support the developing country in building up in environment with key to our crowd or mobilize finance to achieve its targets, including the education and material. They are briefly introduced China climate financial policy government since the end of the dual carbon has a 1+ policy framework.
Hong Yu, sorry to
policies.
interrupt. Could you try turning your camera off so that maybe the bandwidth might help? Thank you.
How about how? Hello, can you hear now? Seems that I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, since the announcement of the dual carbon, China has been promoting the various policies needed, the sector policies, the national and local policies needed to implement dual carbon target. And for China, a think tank evaluation and research has shown that China is able to achieve early carbon emission peak before 2030. However, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 will take really great effort. It's really a challenge for China to really decarbonize the economy within 30 years. So the estimates figure for the financial demand range from 190 billion RMB for energy investments alone to 590 trillion RMB for the low and low carbon transition in the next 2 years. So where would China as these financial resources? Actually, China has a period of relatively comprehensive finance policies started in 2016, where the guideline by establishing the green financial system issued in the development of China's green financial policy system. Since in the following 6 years, we have seen that China has in the work group, the PBOs, and also as the green bonds and green bonds, which whose markets ranked were largest and the
Okay, why don't we actually stop here and let's come back to you in a bit to see if the connection's better. I would like to go back to Richard. He actually just wrote a book a little while ago on the case for New Bretton Woods. And at the COP here, we're hearing a lot of talk about the Bridgetown Agenda, right? That's gathered steam. I was at an event yesterday where the finance minister of Ghana also called for a Marshall Plan. And so we can see, these calls growing for sort of a large-scale reform, right, of the multilateral architecture, broadly speaking. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of, what have we learned so far, right, in terms of our efforts on multilateral debt relief more generally? How do you see that fitting into what these sort of larger calls are asking for? Like, what really needs to change, and sort of, particularly with a view towards, or looking back at history in terms of what have we really learned so far to really push these great ideas forward.
Sure. If you start from, a good place to start maybe is with the report that was launched during this COP earlier this week by the group under Nick Stern and the LSE, which identified or came up with the number of $1.3 trillion per year that was needed by developing countries to support their transition. That's developing countries excluding China, actually. China was not included in that number. And I think that's the right kind of number that we need to start with in terms of thinking about the mobilization challenge. When you dig into the weeds of that report, you would find that of the 1.3 trillion, something like around 400 trillion would come from private sector. That is largely debt. That is debt-based. And a larger portion of that, in fact, would come from developing countries themselves mobilizing something in the order of $450, $500 billion a year. And the rest would come from the multilateral system, which when you look at the numbers, it's probably a doubling of what is on the table now for this kind of investment. But it's a relatively small number in the order of $250, $300 billion a year. Now the problem with this, there are three problems with this analysis, I think. One is that we know that developing countries many developing countries cannot acquire more debt to meet this under the current circumstances, cannot acquire more debt to make the investments they need. To give you an example, in our 2019 Trade and Development Report, we looked at what kind of investments would be required in low and middle income countries just to meet the first 4 sustainable development goals. That's poverty, food, education, and health. And when we looked at the kind of investments that would be required to achieve that, developing countries would either have to be able to grow at something like 10 or 11% a year to mobilize the resources to make the investments needed. That's not going to happen. Or they would have to double their debt load to be able to release the resources to make this investment. That's not going to happen either. So and the notion that somehow adding more debt can be a solution to mobilizing this kind of resource is a non-starter as far as we're concerned. And not only that, of course, for developing countries, the burden of debt makes it very, the kind of scale that they've acquired over the last 20 years in particular, the scale of that debt makes it very difficult for them to mobilize domestic resources. There's constant pressure to service the debt. There's constant pressure from the external balance as interest rates rise, as currencies collapse, as the commodity prices fall, and countries that are dependent on commodity prices find it difficult to mobilize resources for the domestic investment. So that's a very ambitious number for mobilizing domestic resources, given the kinds of burdens that developing countries face. Now, it's the job of the international system to alleviate those burdens. That's what they were set up to do, essentially, to ensure that countries did not have to adjust through austerity measures, to ensure that there would be sufficient public investment both for short-term imbalances on the external balance, to finance imbalances on the external balance, to ensure that there was sufficient fiscal space that they could mobilize resources to make the kinds of investments in the public sector that were needed to drive a development agenda. And to some extent, although it was never an effective part of the multilateral system, to deal with the sovereign debt burden when it became overwhelming and unsustainable. So that the multilateral system should be doing all these three things, and it's doing none of these three things properly. When it comes to debt relief, we know that it delivers too little, too late. We know that the major form of adjustment to external imbalances is austerity. That's the policy conditionalities that are attached to most loans still that come from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So we don't have a system that seems to be able to deliver what it was originally intended to deliver when it was set up some 75 years ago. So the work that Rishi mentioned that I did with colleagues, Kevin Gallagher from the Boston University, is an attempt to re-examine the kind of international financial architecture with an eye to the reforms that would, first of all, get it back to doing what it was set up to do, which is to avoid austerity adjustments, to ensure there's enough liquidity in the system so countries don't have to adjust through deflation, to provide that kind of support that allows the fiscal space to expand so that they can make the necessary public investments that are needed to drive the development agenda, etc. Obviously, in the face of a climate challenge, the scale of that kind of reform is even greater today, we would argue, than it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago when the Bretton Woods institutions began to move away from their original mandate into what we would call loosely a neoliberal kind of mandate and view of the world. I mean, and to take an example again that I think is very telling, because it's come back to this COP from the original Bretton Woods story. The kind of high point of the Bretton Woods story, at least in my opinion, was the Marshall Plan. And a lot of people talk about the need for a Marshall Plan to kind of come back into the narrative to deal particularly with the adaptation challenge in developing countries. And it's a very good analogy. I mean, if you look at the Marshall Plan, first of all, the American government for 5 years spent 1% of its GDP every year financing the Marshall Plan. So if you take that number and translate it to today and assume that it's not only the US that should be involved in financing a Marshall Plan, but also other developed countries, those countries that benefited from the original Marshall Plan that got them on their feet again after the end of the Second World War, so Europe and Japan and other countries. Your 1% of the GDP of those countries is probably something in the order of $500 billion a year. That's the kind of money I think you should be talking about for funding a Marshall Plan today. Not only that, most of the money of the original Marshall Plan was in the form of grants, not in the form of loans. So it was a grant-based model, which is what we want today. And it was a model that was very conscious of not cutting down the policy space available to European economies to fashion a policy agenda that was consistent with the local needs of Germany and France and Italy, which were all very different. All these countries, just like developing countries today, have their own specificities when it comes to achieving a climate-friendly development strategy. So the Marshall Plan is a perfect analogy, I think, for what developing countries need today. And at the end of the Marshall Plan, not irrelevantly, the big kind of project that in a way ended the Marshall Plan was a massive debt cancellation strategy for Germany. Something like 50% at the London conference in 1954, something like 50% of German debt was cancelled under an agreement with the various creditor countries. So if you add, these are exactly the steps that we need, the elements that we need in a kind of climate-friendly development strategy for the 21st century. And it worked. I mean, we don't have to kind of spit out some sort of utopian strategy to convince the Europeans that they should be moved. They benefit. Part of the reason that they became successful in the post-war era was because this model worked for them, worked tremendously well for them. And so what we need to do, I think, is to take these elements of the original Marshall Plan and weave them into a strategy that matches the kinds of challenges that developing countries face today, not only the economic challenges that they face with debt and declining commodity prices and all kinds of things, but also that can accommodate at least the adaptation side of the climate challenge as well.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. That was a great overview, and I think the Marshall Plan being a very relevant analogy, I think is I think definitely something to take up further. I wanted to go to Saliha with what you were talking about earlier on climate resilient debt clauses. Could you expand on that a little bit? And something else I wanted to ask you, something rather specific actually, was yesterday, Finance Day. The MDBs launched a joint framework on development policy loans, sort of aligning DPLs with Paris if there's anything you'd like to share sort of from an AIB perspective, because I think when we think about debt relief more generally, right, how can these loans be aligned, not sort of at the project level, but more generally at the sort of more macro level? Could you share any insights that you may have on sort of development policy lending and how that could help mobilize investments in these countries?
Thanks very much. Just to comment, points well taken on Bretton Woods, and mindful that we need to also change the way we're doing things. So in that context, I'd say about climate resilient debt clauses, the UK COP26 presidency was very much trying to engage MDBs on this. The Inter-American Development Bank, one of our counterparts, has worked on this. That's something that's public, and they have operationalized it in terms of principal payments. What we're doing within our bank and trying to explore with our risk department is how do we design this so that it works within the context that we currently have in terms of our AAA rating, and doing it so that it's also targeted to those most in need. And it would be either reducing the repayment terms over a particular time period, and then perhaps after that time period having some sort of agreement that they may need to pay back some of that's in that time period. So I think we have to figure out what's going to work within the context of us, as the case is. And I have another MDB colleague here sitting in the audience as well, who probably also knows this, that we have within our institutions the investment operations team, we have the climate operations and risk, and the advantage that we currently have in our bank is that we're relatively small, so we're trying to really get that conversation going as quickly as possible. In terms of your second question on, so at the moment we trying to explore this in different ways, but a decision hasn't been made, and we came to COP to say that we are trying to explore this. So of course, if there's people in the audience who have experience in this complex area, we're open to discuss. The second, in terms of development policy lending, which is, I think you may be referring to policy-based lending, as I understand. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank itself is the reason we have that partnership model is that we don't want to be redoing what others are doing. And other MDBs are supporting on this policy level. I think that by virtue of us working through the Paris Alignment Framework, we do come across those questions, because the questions are, does the country have a low carbon pathway? What do we assume for that if they don't? And then you get into the policy area, and how do you support on that? So I think that the MDBs were trying to, and are still trying to, work together to support countries at the policy level, because within the Paris alignment there's consideration of both the NDCs and also long-term strategies, and there's not, and because we have to look at whether there's long-term strategies as well within the consideration of several different types of investments in which that would be relevant. There's only a few countries who have a long-term strategy in place, so that's where the challenge arises, and we don't have at the moment a mechanism that helps to address that, which points to the fact that, again, coming back to my original point, we need to be careful about having lots of requirements, and it then can be counterproductive for that overall overriding question of climate and development. And that's why I think the best way is to support those country-led platforms. I mean, one of them which is being put forward and has been designed by Her Excellency Minister Rania here is the NOEFI Energy Pillar Partnership. And it is country-led. And MDBs would, like ours, would want to co-develop in that context projects. So that's where I suppose I would tie that into how best to support on policy. So I think that's quite a nice, interesting model that has come out of COP27 announcements.
Yeah, great, thank you. Let me quickly go to the floor to see if there are any questions, and then I'll come back to the panel for any final concluding remarks. If you have a question, you could wave your hand, and I believe we have somebody with a mic. Yes, Katie?
Hello, thank you very much, panelists, for your interventions. Really interesting contributions also bring in the question of debt sustainability into the larger global financial architecture. I have a couple of questions. My first one is, obviously we've seen the coalition being launched yesterday, which is a starting point for bringing debt into the climate discussions, which is obviously very welcome. How can that be built on to bring around a broader systemic change to the debt challenges facing, 60% of low-income countries and about a third of emerging markets? And then my second question is, it feels like there is a growing momentum for questions of reform of international financial architecture at the COP. From the panelists' perspective, what are some of the milestones that we might see coming out of COP27 and moving towards COP28? Thank you.
So I have a question. Just an example of Kenya, where 64.2, there's a public debt proportion of GDP to 64.2. It's quite high. We are basically using most of the money to pay debt. On the other hand, we've managed to work so far and secured over 93% of our electricity grid being clean from renewable sources. On the other hand, the countries in the middle of the drought currently, ravaging, and 4.3 million Kenyans are impacted. Why is this conversation not coming down to such countries, to such levels of countries? And are the debt for nature swaps a probable solution in such a situation? Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, let me go to Richard first, and then I'll go to Celia next.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that this COP has really put debt at the center of the discussion. I mean, in terms of a country like Kenya, I mean, you do get neglected. You're not an LDC, so that immediately is an issue. You have a fair amount of private debt. I mean, one of the features of 21st century debt has been the incredible increase in private creditors, and not just banks, but what we call shadow banking institutions, the BlackRocks and the asset management companies of this world, hedge funds, others that have become part of the debt landscape have become a much more prominent feature of developing country lending, particularly to countries of middle income, upper middle income status. And, you know, the advanced economies don't want to talk about that debt. I mean, we saw that in the case of Sri Lanka, right? Well, I think Russia pointed out the fact that, you know, immediately when countries like Sri Lanka have gone into debt, advanced economies want to talk about China. They don't want to talk about the much larger holders of debt, which is private sector agencies, most of which are, of course, located in the advanced economy. So we've got to get over that hurdle of bringing in private creditors into the discussion of debt restructuring, debt relief, and ultimately debt cancellation, which is necessary. In the peculiar case of Kenya, a lot of this stuff depends also on the timing of your debt servicing. Kenya was a country that didn't have big debt servicing this year. You've got big debt servicing coming over the next couple of years, and the pressure on a country like Kenya, or Ghana for that matter, will be actually intensifying at the very moment that the global economy is about to go into recession, in which interest rates are clearly going to be rising even further as central banks in the advanced economies mistakenly use monetary policy as the only tool for solving their inflation problem. So there's a lot of pressure coming down the road for a country like Kenya, unfortunately, which I don't think the multilateral system is geared to handling, right? The multilateral system can get away with debt crises if those crises are in relatively small number of ideally small countries. That's the situation. Our worry is that that's not going to be the case over the next 18 to 24 months, because a number of larger developing countries could be going into a crisis at the same time. And that's a real worry, because what we don't have, in answer to the first question, is of course a systematic multilateral mechanism for handling sovereign debt problems. It's an argument that UNCTAD has put forward for decades, actually, since the last of the great debt crises in the 1980s. You know, every capitalist economy that functions has its own bankruptcy rules. When companies or individuals go into a debt crisis, there are a set of rules in place that both creditors and debtors must abide to get the debtor through the crisis in a way that doesn't completely damage them and allows them to work through a debt crisis, and at the end of it at least be in some sort of semi-robust financial situation so they can get back on their feet and start investing again or whatever. Now, we don't have that kind of system at the multilateral level. We've argued for a long time that you need that kind of system to be able for countries to work through an unsustainable debt position, not in a way that is both timely and relatively fair to both the creditor and the indebted country. So some kind of sovereign debt workout mechanism is essential for a healthier multilateral system. The IMF tried it in the early 2000s, and it was hit very hard and very quickly by the US Treasury, who doesn't want to see this kind of system in place. But given that debt has increased by multiple fold since the early 2000s, it's very difficult, at least from our point of view, to see any other way of handling the debt problem than to have a kind of rules-based system. Debt swaps can be an important. Debt swaps have a role to play, but they can't. They're on too small a scale to be able to solve the kind of problem that we're talking about. You know, debt swaps have been around for 40 years. In that 40 years' time, you've had an estimated 140 type of debt swaps to the tune of something like $2 to $3 billion. This is, given the scale of the problem that we're talking about, this is very insignificant, and they can be scaled up. We think they can be scaled up, but not to solve this kind of problem. The IMF actually had a very decent working paper they launched 2 or 3 months ago that recognizes that debt swaps have a useful role to play in releasing resources in countries that have a sustainable but difficult debt problem. In countries that have an unsustainable debt position, debt swaps are not going to be very much help at all. And sadly, more and more countries are going to be in the unsustainable debt position as the world economy goes into the kind of crisis that we're seeing.
Great, thank you, Richard. Celia, any final thoughts?
I think that you know, in our case, in terms of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we operate in a certain way at the moment in terms of being responsive to our clients. So, for instance, with the Sri Lanka situation, I mean, the way we were able to support was to provide a credit line when they were in a difficult situation where it was at you know, at a better rate and without getting them into a debt situation that's unsustainable. Right now, for instance, at this very moment, we also are supporting Pakistan with building resilience with active counter-cyclical expenditures program. It's called BRACE, and we are providing capital there to support Pakistan's development program to address the social issues from this economic fallout at the moment in Pakistan from the impacts of the flooding. I'm sure it's not enough. It's a 500 million tranche that's being provided. But that's the way, at the moment, AIB is trying to act. At the same time, we're trying to see what we can do in terms of broader frameworks. And we work within the context of the other MDBs to try to come to solutions together. We know that there's a challenging macroeconomic context. In fact, this is probably within the discussions of every MDB as to what do we do in this new economic context, because we have limited fiscal space. We have to change the way we also operate, and we have to work with different stakeholders. So in terms of milestones you were asking about, I think the main thing that I'm seeing here is because everyone is focused on implementation, every actor is trying to put forward a specific a platform, and that's what I see with the NOEFI one. I know it's early days, and there needs to be a driver for everything. So we have the what, and the how is something that I think is even more important, is listening to others, learning from these reports that are coming out, seeing immediately how that can be acted upon. Because, I mean, we don't have enough time. It's been said a lot here. We have limited time to talk, and right now in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, our mindset and what we're trying to do is quickly move forward with particular solutions in this current context of a new macroeconomic reality. And also, interestingly, we're, you know, most of our members are developing countries. We're not an MDB that might have, you know, a majority perhaps of capital from developed countries. We actually have a majority of funding that's coming from developing countries. So we're in a bit of a unique space, but again, a lot to learn and to see what we can do next. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists for joining, and to all of you for coming to this session today. I'll definitely be looking out for more sort of announcements regarding country platforms. That's something the presidency is leading quite well, and so that's something to look out for in the next week or so. But thank you all for coming to this session, and for those of you joining online, thank you for tuning in. And yeah, hope to see you around. Thank you.